Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. Okay, today we are meeting with Steve Chalke. In 1985, Steve founded the Oasis Trust to set up housing, healthcare and educational projects with the aim of alleviating poverty. Oasis has since developed into a group of charities which work currently in 9 countries across 3 continents, Europe, Asia and Africa, and they aim to deliver housing, education, healthcare, training, youth work and family support, and much more besides. Steve is originally from Croydon, that's in South London. He trained as a Baptist minister in 1981 and continues to be active in the church. He's written many books and appeared on radio and TV. Steve is a very active social activist. Pleased to meet you, Steve.
It's great to meet you. Thank you, David.
Hi, Steve. Good to have you on with us today.
And it's great to meet you, Naomi, as well.
Thank you. Could we start, Steve, with you telling us a bit about Oasis and its ethos and values?
Yeah, well, Oasis grew out of my story. And in actual fact, now Oasis has grown very large as an organisation. And I quite often get asked to talk about what we believe. And I have to talk about my beginnings because the two are all kind of linked up together. I am Anglo-Indian, so my dad was Indian, my mum was English. I was, as David's already said, I was born in South London, in Croydon, and I was born at a time when racism was a live issue all the time for us. You know, there were members of my mum's family who really didn't like the fact that at all that she'd married a very dark-skinned Indian. There were people that would cross the road to get away from having to walk past my dad as he picked me up from school, etc. So I grew up knowing the pain of racism, and I grew up and the exclusions that brought, especially to my dad, who bore it very well, and to my mum, who lost so much in making the decision to marry him and live with that exclusion. And the other thing is because it was very hard for him to get a job. You know, like many others from the Caribbean, he'd come to this country to help us rebuild after the Second World War in those years, and then the welcome received wasn't the welcome promised, and so we lived in poverty. Those two big things had a huge and positive influence on my life, actually, because I knew in my soul what it was to be left out, and I knew in my soul what it was to be poor. In my teens, there was a girl that I fancied. I should tell you this bit. There was a girl that I fancied, and I started going to the youth club that she went to that happened to be held in a church hall on the side of Palace Football Ground, or at one end of the Palace Football Ground. And I lived up the road. She was beautiful. Her name was Mary Hooper. And so I went just so I could look at her, basically, every Friday night, so I could gaze at her. And one Friday night, she said the best thing to me ever. I say that she got a friend to tell me that she thought I was ugly and she'd never go out with me. And that, as I've often said to Mary since, changed my life for the better, because I stumbled home that night thinking my life was going to be without Mary and what was I going to do. I was walking up the side of Selhurst Park, the Palace Ground, and I decided that I decided that the school I went to always told me my life was useless and nothing. They told everyone that. You know, we were being prepared for the factory line, the production line in the factory. But down at this youth club, I realised they told us a different story, that lives had meaning and purpose, even if we never grasped what it was. So I decided that even if Mary Hooper didn't like me, fancy me, I'd go back the next Friday, that I was going to be a Christian because they seemed to like me more than anyone else. And here's the strange bit. I decided that when I grew up, I was going to start a school that was worth going to. I was going to begin a house for young people who had never been told they weren't loved by anyone. My mum and dad were brilliant, but I had friends that didn't enjoy that. And rather randomly, that when I grew up, I was going to start a hospital. And I'd be a church leader because I was going to go to the church. So I got in, told my mum all this. And that was the beginning of Oasis at the age of 14 in my head. And then from that moment on, it's a strange thing. Everything drove me towards that. I had this wonderful gift, that came from outside myself, that from that moment on, I knew what my life was about. And I still do. It's a wonderful gift, isn't it? And so the values of Oasis, as it developed, and it took a long time to develop. I was only 14, but it took a long time, many years to develop. The values of Oasis were around inclusion, the worth of every single person. And Oasis formalized that in the end, in that what we do is we aim to build or contribute to building healthy communities where everyone is valued, everyone can flourish, and everyone can fulfill their God-given potential. So that rather eclectic things, David, that you mentioned, that we do youth work and housing and education. I can't remember all the other things that you said. And that people might, as you were going through it, I thought, God, what a strange list of things that is. But once you realise it's all about building a healthy community where everyone is in and can flourish, and it all makes sense because it's all the same thing, not different things.
So that's a really powerful story, Steve. Thanks for sharing it. How did that, that vision of what you wanted to create, how did that become reality? How did you get started with?
Well, I went back to the youth club the next Friday, and I told one of the guys there that was running it. They were very kind, these guys that ran it. It was a typical church youth club. The girls all stood at one corner at one end of the room, the boys all the way at the other corner. Nobody had the courage to talk to each other. And there was some table tennis tables, as I seem to remember it, and you could get a Coke, buy a Coke or a Pepsi or whatever it was. And then at the end, they always did this little epilogue talk, they called it, for 5 minutes. And the thing was, all these guys that ran it, they were really old, but they were so kind. It seemed to me they were just about to draw their pensions. But over the years, I went back and asked their advice. And over the next few months, I realised they weren't old at all. They were all students. They were in their early 20s, and they were doing this on Friday night because they love working with kids. But when you're 14, a 20-year-old looks as though they're just about to kick up the daisies, don't they, really? Anyway, so I went back and chatted to them. One was called Ken, and a guy called Steve, same name as me. They took me under their wing, and Steve, he put together a band, and he taught me to play the bass guitar. And this band, we started going to other youth clubs to sing, and I told him about all the things I wanted to do, and then he a vicar, because they were all training to be vicars. That was the thing. That's why they were doing the thing in the church, you see. And he went to live on a housing estate, a really tough housing estate, with a little church there with his wife. And when I left school at 18, he said, "Why don't you come and work with us?" So I went to live on that estate for 2 years, and I worked in a factory. I was a labourer in a factory to earn some money, and then I spent it on setting up a youth group and a theatre company, little theatre company, and I did that for 2 years and learned so much that way. Then I applied to go to theological college because I wanted to be a church leader, and they said, "Well, you're young and wet behind the ears." That's what they really say. So they said, "Well, we want you to go somewhere else and work there." And they sent me to a place called Gravesend in Kent, which I'd never heard of until that day. And I worked there. But this time I didn't have to work in a factory. I just worked as a youth worker in this church for a year. And it was a fantastic experience. And I was learning all the time. And then the guy who ran the church at Gravesend, his name David, was David. He died a few years ago. When I finished doing my studies, he phoned me up and he said, "Why don't you come back and work with me and be a youth worker with me?" And he gave me a job. And by now I was a full-time youth worker in this big church, So I never, ever went for a job interview. I just got these opportunities with people. And the only thing that, the thing that happened, I fell into Oasis, really. I said to these leaders in this church I was now a youth worker for, I said, look, I really want to leave, not because I don't like you, but I got to set up this house and this school and this hospital. And I'd got married by then. My wife's name's Cornelia. And they said, look, we can't pay you, but I worked for them for 4 years, but you can stay in the house that came with the job for 1 year, just 12 months. You got to find your salary, but we give you free lodging for a year, and then you're on your own. So you got 12 months to make this happen. So I left my job, and that really was the beginning of Oasis. And my wife, whose name's Cornelia, I think it just said, she said to me, well, we got to make something happen because we got no income, except that I went to do youth weekends and things, and they gave me bits of money. She said, and we can't start a school or a hospital. And I said, I remember we were having fish and chips one day, and I said, why is that? And she said, because we don't know anything. We're thick. No, I thought to myself, she's right, because she had the same kind of education as I did, and we didn't know anything. So I figured that trying to set up a house was easier than our school. And we managed to make it through. And for the next years, we battled and battled away. And eventually we were given, in effect, an old house in Peckham in South London with no roof, no stairs, though it was on 2 floors, but 16 bedrooms. It was falling apart. And we got it slowly set up. It was murder, like murder. And Cornelia said to me, we should call this house Oasis, because we're going to take young people in and give them supported housing. And these are young people who've been beaten up by life, traumatized by life, not understood, abused, neglected. And it's like we're going to create an oasis for them. So let's call it Oasis. And so we got a friend of ours to help us set up a charity called Oasis. We never did call the house Oasis because we figured no child wants to live in an institution called Oasis or anything else. But the charity that ran it was called Oasis and still is. And that's how we got going.
That's a really great story, Steve. And clearly you and Cornelia were sort of matched with similar passions for this project. But, something really inspirational about having this idea and working so hard to make it happen. You must be relatively young at the time as well, I guess.
Yeah, and very frustrated. Mm-hmm. Very, very frustrated because no one would listen to me. I didn't know anyone. No one would return our letters, our phone calls. No one wanted to invest in us at all. Looking back on it, of course, why should they? I was 29. We were both 29. We'd never done any of this before. In fact, the boss of the housing division of Southwark Council, Peckham is in Southwark, the borough of Southwark, I went to see him and he said, you'll do this over my dead body. We don't want people like you coming around here. I honestly did. We're not going to help you. Well, we finally got open. Now, the funny thing is, all these years later, not only did we still run that hostel, we run many, many more supported housing establishments around the country, but Southwark Council, for whom he worked, have now given us the responsibility of running all their housing for supported housing for 16 pluses. So we oversee, we've got the contract to run all the housing in the very borough from the very office where the guy told me we'd never support you. And I'm not blaming him at all. I realised through life, why would anybody have trusted a 29-year-old who walks in and says, do this? It was really hard, and I can't convey to you the frustration of not being listened to. But I learned this, which I often say to people now. Vision and frustration are the same thing. If you've got vision, what is vision? It's dreaming of and hoping for and longing for and praying for what has not yet happened. And what is frustration? It's dreaming of and hoping for and longing for and praying for what's not yet happened. It's the same thing. I often say to people now, if you're in a job, if you're doing something that, as your full-time or, anything you're committed to, something that you don't find frustrating, I'd leave it and get a job that does frustrate you and hand your chair to a new person who will come in and be frustrated, because that's the only way change and positive advance comes about.
Thank you. And so the other thing that comes through, Steve, is this kind of like, I suppose, a deep sense of religious or spiritual commitment. I wondered, were your family, were your parents religious or spiritual?
They were religious. I wouldn't have called them spiritual. They were kind of slightly lapsed religious. They took us to church. I got a brother and two sisters on Sunday mornings when I was a kid, which was a truly boring experience. I'm sure all the people were lovely. It was an hour where we had to sit there in our Sunday best, and Sunday was the most boring day of the week, without doubt. And so I abandoned all that, but I got back involved through the story I've told you, Mary Hooper's story, and that. The funny thing is that my mum, after that, became very committed to that church. And in years beyond that, she became the convener of their luncheon club, and she's died now. But for years and years, she did all this stuff, and she got really engaged in it. But she hadn't been before. My dad continued to go to church, but was never. He was never. So I suppose I don't want to belittle him. He's wonderful to me, but he went and believed this stuff, I think, but he wasn't an activist of any sort. It was really those guys who ran that youth club that gave me a sense of passion about all of this. It's wonderful. And the funny thing is, Steve, the guy I talked about, his name's Steve Flashman. I'm still in touch with him. Still in touch all these years later. That's a great youth worker, isn't it? That's some great youth worker. And so for me, what I would say, Naomi, in answer to your question, for me, that, the trigger moment in my life, the moment I discovered who I was, the moment of transcendence, the wake up moment was through the message of that church, that I was loved by God, but it was my responsibility to demonstrate that love, that acceptance, that belonging to others. So I would say that was the turning point in my life, and it's still the thing that inspires me.
It's really powerful, and it's reminding me of some of the conversations we've had previously with people who've been in prison, who often have not had that experience before they've come to prison. They've felt, excluded and marginalised, as you're aware, and very much, on the fringes of society. And then how, an encounter with someone in prison who believes, a staff member who believes in them, what a powerful experience that can be in terms of giving people hope and the aspiration to do something different with their lives. But you've told us that you've mentioned about the sort of supported housing that you offer to young people. What other sorts of projects do Oasis do?
Endless. There's about 6,000 staff in Oasis now in England and lots elsewhere. We run schools, primary schools and secondary schools in England. We run 54 of them at the moment. There's about 33,000 children in our schools. I've just before talking to you, actually, I've just been talking to a guy that I met for the first time online. I come down and I'm going to show him around some of the things we're doing. His name's Graham, and exactly the story you talked about. He's Scottish, Glaswegian, he's gang life, et cetera, a tough life. And then one Christmas Eve, he said, his friends died, stabbed to death. He survived a stabbing. Friends took their lives, drug addiction, the whole thing. And then one on Christmas Eve, he went to a carol service. And he said, in that moment, I woke up. That was my point of spiritual awakening. And he said, I have not touched a drink ever since. I have not taken a drug ever since. My life was touched, and I'm completely different. And I think that everything we do is about that. I was talking to him because, in actual answer to your question, which I was getting around to, trust me, I was, is one of the latest projects, if you like, that we've set up. It's taken 14 years to do it. Is we've opened an alternative to a jail, so a youth jail. So it's an alternative to Feltham. It's an alternative to what they call a YOI, Young Offenders Institution. And I've worked on that project, and then we've worked on that project as Oasis since 2010, one way or the other, and we opened in 2024. But from now on, a judge in England can choose to send. Well, actually, it's not the judge that does it; it's the judge that creates the sentence. But then there's something called the placements committee. Once the sentence is set, they can choose for a child to come to Oasis Restore, which is all about therapeutic care. We are different. We're not a prison. We have bedrooms, not cells. We have student accommodation, not wings. We have windows, not bars. We have youth workers, not uniformed guards. They are our students, not our inmates. And that is a huge project. I mean, as I say, it's taken all these years to set up, and it really is a breakthrough in youth justice. Now, and they would tell you that if we were talking with the Ministry of Justice today. It's been said to me on various occasions that it's as big a breakthrough as the abolition of hanging, because it's not about punishment anymore. It's about working with a child or a young person towards their healing. All of the young people that come to us have committed horrific crimes, all of them violent crimes, but all behaviour is communication of an inner angst or a pain or a fear or an anger that's been pushed under. The problem is you can't push your anger or your anxiety or your frustration under. I always think it's a bit like, if you're in a swimming pool and you've got one of those beach balls, or you're in the sea, you try, that you've puffed up, you've blown up, you try to push it under, but you cannot hold it under. In the end, it boom and jumps out at you again. That's what trauma does to you, which comes at kids in all sorts of ways, from all sorts of situations, and not necessarily their home, but often their home life. It can be that they're an atypical learner. It can be that they've not had a home life, that they've been shunted from pillar to post, fostered. It can be all sorts of things. It can be what happens to them through other influences. But here are these children, and they have committed horrendous crimes. But this is about their path to healing instead of more trauma. Trauma is just the Greek word meaning wound, as I'm sure you know. And therapy comes from the Greek word meaning healing. And everything is wounding or healing in life. And we are there to be healing.
I think you're also getting at something important there in terms of we have the lowest stage of criminal responsibility in Europe, don't we? In terms of, the fact you're emphasising they are children. And I think that can quite often be forgotten in certainly media coverage of when young people commit serious crimes. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, yes, I do. And that's why I've talked about them as children. And then perhaps in what I said children and young people. But of course, we talk about them as children all the time. And then people say, you've got children in there. And I say, yeah, some are 14 and 15 and 16. And they say, well, they're not children. I say, yeah, they are. They are children. I had the privilege for 8 years, I think it was, of working as a special advisor to the UN around human trafficking, because the Oasis has a charity that does a lot of anti-human trafficking work. And they asked me to do this job. And that was fascinating for those years. And the UN, United Nations, says in no country should the age of criminalisation be less than 14. That's a minimum. There are lots of European, there are a number of European countries where the age of criminal responsibility is 18, which makes sense, because that's when we tend to think someone becomes an adult. We give them a vote, etc., etc. They can drive a car, all of those things. But then there are, you go through, I can't quite remember now, Portugal, I think, is 16, and you go down and you get to some countries that are 12, but then we are 10. And people never, in England, they never find that very shocking until you say this to them. You say, there are a few states in America where the criminal age is tiny. I think it's two states in America where the criminal age of responsibility is 6. And then people always, if you say it to an audience, they all go, and then I say, but that's only 4 years younger than ours. And if you go to European countries and you say we criminalise a child at the age of 10, they also have the, you don't do, why? Of course, you can say it's just a technicality. The child still commits a horrendous act, but it's not a technicality. In Portugal, for instance, pick on Portugal as I mentioned them, if a 14-year-old is involved in a violent act, the press says, how did we let this child down? And there's an exploration of what it was in society that's not allowed that child to develop well. We now know so much about brain science, don't we? With childhood and adolescent brain development. We know that an adolescent isn't a mini adult, just because they shave or have grown breasts or whatever. They're not a mini adult. We know all that. Scientifically, we know. It's not a view, it's just the fact. So they're kind of saying, so what have we done that this child's brain didn't develop well? What can we do better? And they begin to explore that. When a 14-year-old does something horrendous in this country, we, on the front pages of the papers, it's kind of lock them up, throw away the key, 14-year-old thug. Instead of 14-year-old child, what have we done? What should we be doing better? It's a very important point, and it's got to change. It's draconian. We laugh that America has the death penalty. Well, we don't laugh, we mourn. How stupid to do that to young men who are illiterate, who are black, who've never been given opportunity, and you do that. To criminalise a child at the age of 10 ranks along with that same stupidity, in my view.
Thank you.
Well, there's a lot there, Steve. I've got a couple of things I want to go back on, if I may. I think Stop the Traffic was the name of the organisation you were referring to.
Yes.
Earlier on. My son got involved with it a bit when he was up in Manchester a few years ago.
Thank you. You're a good father.
Funnily enough, though, through a girlfriend. So never underestimate the power of relationships. The other thing I was interested in was to do with assimilation, because I've got a sort of Indian background as well. My great-grandmother was Indian and came over here, and it's fascinating when I look at the old photos, dating back from my great-grandmother through my grandmother and great-aunts, who still look very, very dark-skinned and Indian, and now I don't think anyone has ever thought that I was anything other than English, apart from once when I was in Germany and somebody thought I was Turkish. So, and I presume you've not encountered any issues around your Indian background, is that right?
No, well, I did as a child a lot. So my nickname when I was at school as a kid was half-caste. Which I never took as an insult, really, because, they used to call people ginger.
Yeah.
whatever, didn't they? So, but that's just what I got called a lot of the time, not all the time, but so it was just what I was. What did hurt was I had a girlfriend when I was 17, I think, and her parents. I met her parents, and then she told me that the next time I saw her a few days later, she said, "My parents have said that you can't be my boyfriend because if I fall in love with you and we get married, our children could be throwbacks." And then a few years later, strange, about 3 years later, I I had another girlfriend whose parents were part of a church that I eventually became a minister of, and she said the same thing to me. It's the same word. She said, "My parents say our children could be throwback," and that was traumatizing. That was traumatizing. The funny thing about me now is I've just been to Turkey on holiday, actually, and all the Turkish people think I'm Turkish. So my wife Cornelia always says that to me. She says wherever I go, because my skin is the colour it is. People are always, if I go to it, I've been to Italy or Spain, or they always assume, and you can tell because they come up to you and they start talking in the local dialect, and you have no idea what they're talking about. And then you say I'm British, and they're surprised by that. But then the other thing is, on the other way round, is I was speaking at an event just a few weeks ago. This is typical, and we were talking about discrimination and exclusion and diversity and equality. And I was on a panel, and I made a point. I can't remember what the point was, but probably irrelevant anyway. But it was a point about inclusion. And then somebody else on the panel said to me, really, well, it's fine for white men of a certain age to say that. And then they went on, and I realized they had written me off as a white man. And I'm not. I'm Anglo-Indian. And that's not just a tag. Half my family is Indian. My cousins are Indian. Their children are Indian. We work in India, actually. I am Indian, but I'm also English. Strange thing about being Anglo-Indian, dual race, is I'm not quite Indian when I'm with my Indian family, and I'm not quite English when I'm with the white family. Does that make any sense? You've got this mixedness, and you don't quite fit in anywhere. And I felt that a lot as a teenager, especially when I was told, as those stories I've just told you about. Now I see it as a strength, because I feel that the exclusion, even the Oasis logo, is, if anybody looks it up on the web, it's the messy O of Oasis, the O of Oasis, and it's messy and it's many-stranded. And we call it the kids in our schools wear it as a badge. It's the badge on their blazers or on their sweatshirts, and schools are decorated with it. If I look around this room, there's bound to be, there's one over there. Yeah, there's a messy O on the wall, and it's a messy O because it's many-stranded, and we call it our messy O, our circle of inclusion. So inclusion has become right at the heart of everything Oasis is about. And I think some of that has grown out of my childhood experiences, because we are influenced by them. So it's become a really good thing in my life, but it's been a struggle as well.
Thank you. So, Steve, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, to get your thoughts on really, was to do with opportunity. Because you gave this very colourful description, really, of your work in the early days, and then being asked to go back and use this phrase, "I never applied for a job. I just got the opportunity," which resonated with me, because I feel I was offered an opportunity back in the 70s. I'd been working in the Simon community in Oxford, and after I'd left, they asked me if I'd go back and open a new project. You've made much better use of your opportunity than I did, have to say. Very impressive indeed. But clearly, having an opportunity and being able to see an opportunity when it's there is terribly important for people, particularly young people who feel they don't have any opportunity. So I suppose I'm wondering, what is it that you promote and Oasis might promote in terms of making the opportunities visible to people?
Well, I think that's a brilliant question, and I'm not sure I can do it justice in answering it. But the first thing I would say is this, and I referred to this earlier, that trip home from the youth club, when I had this kind of revelation, I said it had nothing to do with me. It was a gift. It came from outside of me. When I set off home from that youth club, my little 5-6 minute journey to my front door, I had no idea where I would be at the end of that journey. That little walk changed my life, and it gave me direction. It came from God, I would say. Whatever people believe, it didn't come from in me. And it gave me purpose. Mark Twain once said there are only two important days in your life: the day you're born and the day you find out why. And I know many people who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, who really, if you ask them, don't quite know why. Once you're given that why, everything becomes a lot easier, harder as well, because it all gets very frustrating, as I said, but easier because at least you know the way you should be heading, the walk you're on, the pathway you should be on. You may wander off the path, but you still know where the path is. You've got to get back to it. So it's a great gift. So the first thing, David, I would say that one of the great famous Greek philosophers, whose name I always forget, he once said, education isn't the filling of a pail, it's the lighting of a fire. I believe that the education we bring to young people in our schools or at Oasis Restore or some of the other projects we've not talked about, but we run exciting new things that we're developing, it's all about the lighting of a fire. It's that moment of spark. It's that moment when someone wakes up to who they are. And it's about creating that, because you can't externally impose it on a person, as I'm sure you've learned over the years. We all learn over the years. But once the fire is lit, the passion is there, it's our job, isn't it, to fan it, to enable it. And that's what Steve Flashman and the others did for me. They could see what I got, and they taught me to play the guitar, and I joined this band, and they gave me opportunities to speak on stage. And then Steve gave me a chance to go and work with him, and then David Beer, that's the name of the guy who gave me the second chance, and I went to work with him. And then it was his church that released me to kind of make the beginnings of Oasis. So I've been helped through life by people who've seen something and stood with me, fanned that flame, believed in it. I think all of that's important. So my task is, is it too long if I tell you a story? I once, it's true, this story is a great story. I once was asked to go to New Zealand. Well, I went to New Zealand, and whilst I was there, I was asked to do a session, this about 10 years ago, perhaps a little bit more, for educationists and some government ministers who were thinking about schools, because we were running schools in this country, and they were thinking about charter schools, which are a bit like academies and a bit not like academies. So I did this session with them, and then they wanted to take me to a school that they were setting up, because as we find African Caribbean children in this country and Romani children, etc., all of these kids with a sense of where do I belong, where do I fit in, they struggle more than most. And Pacifico kids, as they call them in New Zealand, struggle. And these are the kids from the islands, Fiji, etc., etc. And they drop out of school. So that this school was being set up to work with these children. So I went along, and it hadn't opened, and I talked with the head teacher, and we just got chatting about different ways of lighting the fire, sport being one of them. And she asked me if I played sport, and I said, well, I used to play football. I go running now because I do it on my own, but I used to play football, and I used to play a bit of rugby. And she said, where did you play? I said, on the wing. And she said, I got a cousin who used to play a bit of rugby. And then she said, what are you doing tonight? Well, I wasn't doing anything. So she said, I'll ring my cousin, let the three of us go out. We'll have a drink together. So we go out that night, the three of us, and she introduces me to her cousin, who she's told me used to play a bit of rugby on the wing. And his name was Jonah Lomu. And who, as anybody, for those people who don't know about rugby, you can look on any website anytime you like, and Jonah Lomu is always named as the number one greatest rugby player ever. He was the Pele of rugby. So there I am sitting with Jonah Lomu, and he says, you used to play a bit of rugby. Anyway, having recovered from that, he told me a story. So this is Jonah's story. So I was asking him about some of the things he's achieved. And I said, I bet you got loads of shirts from, all your famous battles. And he said, no. And I said, what? Nobody's ever given you a shirt? You've never swapped shirts? He said, never. And I said, why not? And he told me this story. He said, before the All Blacks play, we sit in the changing room. And when we're called, we go from the changing room into the jersey room. So I said, what happens in the jersey room? He said, well, there's your top, there's your shirt, there's your jersey. They're all set out on a chair each in a ring. He said, but you're called and you go on your own, not with the rest of the team. And you go into that room and you're given the moments you need, and you stand in front of the chair with your jersey on and your number on, and you remember all the great things that have been achieved in this jersey. And he said, and you thank God that you have the privilege of wearing it on this day. And then you pick it up and you put it on. It's about the jersey. It's not about you. Then he said, at the end of the game, you play for the jersey and you play for the team. And at the end of the game, you go back, and when you're called, you go to the jersey room and you fold up your jersey and you place it back on the chair. And he said, and you thank God that on that day you wore that jersey, and you hope that you've moved the reputation of the jersey forward. And I think that my role in life, our role in life, is to move the reputation of the jersey forward. We're all bit players, we're all passing. I was given this gift of knowing what my life was about. But the goal of Oasis is to build healthy communities where everyone can thrive and achieve their God-given potential. So that's about passing the jersey on, isn't it? Leaving a legacy, moving things on. I often say to staff around Oasis, because they say, you got a lot of energy and you never give up and all this kind of stuff. And I say, my job in life is to get as far as we possibly can, to fight and struggle and dream and plan and strategize and get every last inch forward that we can possibly get, because my ending place is your starting place. As Paul Simon put it, one man's ceiling is the next man's floor. So the further we get, that is the beginning place of the next generation. It's about moving the jersey forward. That's it.
Thank you. That's a lovely story about Jonah Lomu, who of course died far too early.
Yeah, he died far too early, and what a tragedy. He died a couple of years after we'd met and spoken.
So I was just thinking, Steve, how do you manage to both promote and maintain the positive and safe culture that you've been talking about? Because as we know, many establishments, many charities, many organisations have been riven by all kinds of difficulty and corruption. How do you do that? Must be a nightmare for you.
Well, somebody asked me about this just the other week, and there's a sense in which I'm just grateful. I'm grateful you're grateful that life is as it is for you. But one of the things that did happen right in the early days of Oasis, you see, so we were running this hostel, this safe house in London, in Peckham, the one I was talking about, and Cornelia says, let's call it Oasis, and we set up a charity called Oasis, and I said it was others that helped me do it, and there were 4 friends that helped me do it, and they all became its trustees, and they said, so are you going to be a trustee? And I said, I don't know why I said this, I must have learnt this from someone else. I said, no, I'm an employee, not a trustee. I need to be capable of being sacked by you. I can't be, I can't mark my own homework type of thing. I didn't use that expression, but you get the point. And they accepted that after some time. And I am not a trustee of Oasis. And I'm not a trustee of any of our charities. We run a whole group of charities now. I'm an employee, so I am accountable. And sometimes, that it's not a walkover, any of that. You really are accountable. We're spending a lot of money. It has to be spent wisely, and you have to be accountable for how you spend it. And it's got to be transparent. I think if I know anything, I'm not claiming any credit in any of this, but I also learned early on, surround yourself with people who know more than you do about everything. So, I can read spreadsheets. I don't swim in them. I'm not a master of them. There are some things I can do. Stick to what you're doing and don't undermine the people that know what they're doing. Build relationship with them, as you say. Relationship is everything. So I think all of that's right. And then, so there's money, isn't there? There's money and status. Everybody bothers about all those things. And sex, that's the other thing. And tragically, so many things go wrong because of that. And I kind of think about this is honestly what I think about it. Right? My life is so busy. I have she's just retired, but I had the same PA for 20 years, Judith. Right? And now Camille is my PA, right? They know everything I'm doing all the time. My diary is organised in 15-minute slots. It's like, so, in a minute, somebody will ring them up. Where are you? Well, you're supposed to be here, you're supposed to be there. And I had to go to America and do a lecture last week. And I was talking to the crew there, one of the professors in the college who knew Bill Clinton and was just about to do some work with him. And I said, the thing that always amazes me is how he managed to do that thing with Monica Lewinsky. I just don't know. In my life, it would be downright impossible. So I think busyness and accountability, make yourself accountable and be accountable all the time. I am accountable.
But I wasn't really worried about you, Steve, actually. I was more concerned about how you keep an eye on somebody down in a project in Southeast Asia, say.
Okay. No, and that's another. So they need to be accountable as well. So, I'm sure you've heard it, we always call it a scheme of delegation here. So that everybody knows who they're accountable to and what they're accountable for. So that's, I think, did I say earlier, I don't know if I did, but genuinely, truly, if I died today, now, it'd be a bit embarrassing for you. First time somebody dies on your podcast, I guess.
We've had a close shave.
Take that one. Yeah. Oh God, yeah, we have.
but then beyond that, truly, what would happen? I mean, people close to me and my family and my friends, people I work closely with in Oasis, they'd grieve, but then everybody would arrange a funeral and they'd say nice things, hopefully, and then that'd be that. And I often say to them, they tell you if you talk to them, I say, listen, the day I die, it's the last big fundraising chance you've got out of me. So don't blow it, and I won't be here to make the most of it. What I mean under all of that is actually, in some ways, I've become superfluous to Oasis, and you can't. So I don't know. I don't know the project managers in England, in London, all the project managers, let alone the project managers in, Chennai, in India or wherever. But what I do know is that we work very, very hard at structure and accountability and care. It's care. Accountability isn't about telling everybody off and beating people with the stick. It's about everyone feeling seen, heard, listened to. It's about proper line management. I always say that the best line manager, when people have annual assessments or annual reviews and things like that, which we do in Oasis, but I always say, the best line managers, the annual assessment only takes 5 minutes because you already know, you know each other, you care about one another, you're carrying one another's burdens. Now, I know it doesn't always work out like that, but it should work out like that most of the time. Of course, in an organisation Oasis size, like I've said, it doesn't always work out. But even in those situations, to be able to work with compassion with someone makes a lot of difference. And I suppose, David, the reason I started with me, when you didn't mean me at all, that's very kind of you to be that trusting of me. But I need to walk the talk. A leader's job isn't just to point the way, it's to be the living, walking, talking embodiment of the ethos. Naomi, you asked me about ethos and values. Like, if the leader talks one set of values and is a different person, then you create a disparity and the whole thing falls into a hole, doesn't it? You have to be that person. And of course, you can't be the person who gets it all right. Somebody came to work with me a few years ago, and she's wonderful and still works with me. And on the first day, I think it was, or the first few days, she sat down with me and she said, it's great to work with you, Steve. I like working with a leader who knows what they're doing. And I said to her, you better leave tonight then, because half the time I haven't got a clue what I'm doing. And I was hoping we could talk about it all together. So don't put yourself on a pedestal. That's the point, because none of us belong there, do we?
Thank you, Steve. This is a fascinating conversation, but we're almost out of time, and I've led us astray. I haven't even asked the first question I was supposed to ask you. So let's just try and sneak that one in before we finish, because I'm interested to know about Oasis Restore, because it's particularly pertinent for listeners who have experience of the criminal justice system. Can you tell us a bit about this project?
Yeah, well, it's based around the thing that you can't punish somebody into health. You can't hurt someone to heal them. You can't hurt someone to help them. It's based around the fact that for all our criminalising of very young children, we spend more money on our criminal justice system than all of those European countries that don't criminalise children so young. We have a greater reoffending rate. Reoffending costs us a fortune. The reoffending, not just the offending, it doesn't work. We know prison doesn't work. I mean, just at the moment that we're recording this, this has been the news this week, hasn't it? Prisons are full to overflowing, and so we released, 1,700 prisoners earlier this week 40% of the way through their sentence. And though we're assured that these aren't people who are a danger to the public in any way, they're probably a danger to themselves in lots of ways. It's because where do they go? What do they do? They've not been nurtured, not been cared for. You just tip someone out of an institution through the gate and expect them to survive. They really, really can't. Or some will, because they're loved and cared for and nurtured and seen and carried and supported by a family. But the strange thing is the most vulnerable people get no care and no support, and they end up in some bed set somewhere, lonely, lost. Prison becomes a pretty safe bet in all sorts of ways. So Restore, Oasis Restore, that's the name we chose to give it. It's a new legal entity, actually. It's called a secure school. We had to push a bill through Parliament. I say we, that was Oasis, but the Ministry of Justice and the DfE were involved. We pushed a measure through Parliament which allowed for the first time a charity to run a custodial establishment. That had never been allowed before. It's a function of the state. And so the Ministry of Justice, the government, is our partner in it, but they're only our partner in it, a good partner, but they're our partner. It's up to us. We formed a new board. It's a new Oasis charity, and the board are responsible, not the Ministry of Justice. We're responsible to the Ministry of Justice and the judicial system for delivering the care that we promise. So the question we ask isn't, what have you done wrong? It's what's happened to you. Now, we know the young people that come to us, the children, as we call them, but they're 16 and 17-year-olds, some. We know that those children that come to us, we know that instead of the what's wrong with you question, we've got to get at so what's happened? We know that they've committed horrendous crimes. We know that there's a victim. We know that there's a victim's family. We know that this behaviour was wrong, and they know it as well. Most people are good at core, aren't they? They really are, in my experience. But put it this way: what I said this last night to an audience I was talking to. I said they were a very well heeled group in the city of London, and I said to them, you all congratulate yourself that you're so well heeled and you're polite and you say please and thank you and after you in the queue instead of pushing in, etc., etc. I said, but don't congratulate yourself. The only reason you can do that is because your prefrontal cortex, the judgment center of your brain, the management center of your brain, is well wired to the rest of it. The problem for a kid who switches, who kicks off, who loses their temper, and we all have anger problems at times, is that our emotional center, our limbic center, where all the sights and sounds come rushing in, the things that people say, our emotional center overloads our management center at the front of our brain, and we just do something stupid. Like my wife says to me, she says, the more stressed you are, the more stupidly you behave. I'm sure that doesn't apply to either of you two, but it applies to me. The more stressed I am, the more stupidly I behave, the stupid things I say and wish I'd not said afterwards. Imagine being a child who lives in a state of hyper stress and hypertension. They've never felt secure. They've never felt soothed. They never felt calm. They live their whole life on alert because of all the trauma they've been through and now perceive everywhere around them. They're always stressed, so their actions are not wired well to their prefrontal cortex. So what our task at Restore is to make those connections, those synaptic connections together, those to link the neurons together, to make new pathways. I don't know if you've ever been skiing. Have either of you been skiing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, when you ski, I've not been skiing very much, but I love skiing. So, I only ever go when I can find someone to pay for me, which isn't very often. But the great thing about, I once skied off piste, right? That's where there's fresh snow, and no one's been down. It's really hard work. But once there's a piste, i.e. a pathway, the snow's been smoothed and crushed, and it's it's a pathway down. It's easy to ski on a piste, isn't it, Naomi? If you've been, It's easy to ski on a piste. In fact, it's very hard to get off the piste.
Yeah.
You're in it, and it's a pathway, and it takes you down, glides you down. But if you try to ski up into the snow that's not been piste bashed, as they call it, it's really hard to do. And our brains are like that. Once there's a neural pathway, you've learned to respond and react in this way. You can stay in it easily. But for a kid who's not got those pathways, they're stuck. They're stuck. And the only way of being wired right is through model attachments, through love, through acceptance, through listening. That's the only way to do it, which is why, of course, punishment doesn't work. So Oasis Restore is set up to do that. So that on that day that the child walks through the gate, we walk through the gate with them and support them long after. We don't abandon them. There's all sorts of formal statutory things set up, but our job is to walk with them at the days, the months, the years beyond as well. But as they re-enter society and leave this institution, they are ready to give, and they are able to give and be involved. That's what Oasis Restore is about. The greatest revolution in youth justice, as I say again, I'm told regularly, since the abolition of hanging. And we need to succeed at this so that we can do away with youth jails, and we can create a more functional and useful and economic and safe way forward.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.
Naomi, I think we've pretty much got everything we can out of Steve.
Flog me to death.
Thanks so much. It was a really fascinating conversation.
It's great to talk to you both. It honestly is. I've enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, David. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. Really enjoyed it. A very uplifting conversation to hear somebody talking so refreshingly about justice.